The night of the 16th of April, 1960, in the city of McAllen, Texas, USA, as preparations for the Easter celebration were taking place within the local Catholic community, a 25-year-old woman named Irene Garza stepped through the doors of Sacred Heart Catholic Church. For her, it was a familiar evening, part of the life of faith she had always maintained. Irene Garza was at that time an elementary school teacher well known within the McAllen community. She was remembered as a young woman dedicated to her work, with a simple lifestyle and someone who always cared for those around her. At 25, Irene was living a stable life, with familiar relationships and a future ahead of her. That evening, Irene went to Sacred Heart Church to attend the sacrament of confession before Easter. This was a routine religious practice for Catholics at the time. There were no signs that this short visit to the church would become the final moment of her life. After entering Sacred Heart Church, Irene Garza never returned home as planned. When her family realized she had lost contact, questions began to arise. A young woman who had a familiar life in the small town of McAllen suddenly disappeared without a clear answer. The incident quickly drew the attention of the community, because Irene was not just a name in a case file, but also a daughter, a friend, and a well-loved teacher. From that moment, the search for answers began. But the case took place in 1960, when investigative technology and forensic science were still highly limited. The initial clues, investigative decisions, and suspicions surrounding the disappearance formed a journey that would last more than half a century. 57 years later, the name Irene Garza once again appeared in headlines when the truth was finally brought to light. But before reaching that day, the story begins on a night before Easter, at a church in McAllen, where a young teacher walked inside and forever changed the history of a community. If you are interested in real-life cases, mysterious cold cases spanning decades, and the journey to seek justice for victims, please subscribe to follow the next stories. When the name Irene Garza appeared in an investigative file that would span more than half a century, she was simply a young woman living an ordinary life in the city of McAllen, Hidalgo County, Texas. Born in 1934, Irene Garza was 25 years old at the time of the 1960 incident. She grew up in a community where people tended to know one another, where family ties, neighbors, and religion played an important role in everyday life. To those who knew her, Irene was remembered as a gentle, devoted young woman who consistently showed care and concern for those around her. Irene worked as a primary school teacher, a profession that required patience and responsibility. Within the education environment, she was known as someone deeply committed to her students. Outside of work, Irene was also an active member of her local community, closely connected to religious life and the traditional values she held important. In 1958, before the incident occurred, Irene was awarded the title Miss All South Texas Sweetheart. The title reflected the image of a young woman admired by her community, confident in her presence, and highly regarded by many. In the early 1960s, McAllen was a small city in southern Texas with a relatively peaceful pace of life. People in the area were closely connected, so an incident involving someone as well known as Irene quickly drew significant attention within the community. However, the state of criminal investigation at the time was very different from today. Authorities primarily relied on witness statements, physical evidence collection, and traditional forensic methods. DNA technology, which would later become crucial in many cold cases, did not yet exist. Before becoming the center of one of the most controversial cases in Texas history, Irene Garza was simply a young teacher with a job, her faith, and her own plans for the future. But her disappearance forced a once peaceful community to confront unanswered questions for many years that followed. Before the night of the 16th of April 1960, Irene Garza was living a familiar life like many other young women in the McAllen community. At 25 years old, Irene had established a stable place for herself in society. She worked as a primary school teacher, a profession closely tied to patience, responsibility, and care for the younger generation. Every day, Irene interacted with young students, families in the community, and people who were already familiar with her image as a dedicated teacher. Outside the classroom, Irene maintained a simple life, closely connected to her family, friends, and relationships within the town. McAllen at that time was a place where members of the community often met and knew one another well. Because of this, Irene was not a stranger among the local residents. She was a familiar face, a young woman who was widely respected. Religious faith was also an important part of Irene's life. She regularly participated in activities related to the Catholic Church and viewed Sacred Heart Church as a place closely connected to her spiritual life. For Irene, the church was not only a place of worship, but also part of the routines and values she had maintained for many years. Those who knew Irene remembered her for her gentleness, proper manners, and strong sense of responsibility in everyday life. Before her name appeared in an investigative file, Irene was simply a young teacher doing the work she loved, surrounded by people she cared about, and making plans for the future. No one in McAllen at the time could have predicted that an otherwise ordinary evening would become a turning point that would completely change the life of Irene's family and leave behind a question that would last for generations. On the 16th of April 1960, it was Holy Saturday night, one of the most important moments in the Catholic calendar. In the city of McAllen, Texas, churches welcomed many parishioners attending religious services ahead of Easter. For many locals, this was a time for prayer, reflection, and spiritual preparation for the upcoming sacred holiday. That evening, Irene Garza left her home and went to Sacred Heart Catholic Church, as she often did. At 25 years old, Irene was a well-known elementary school teacher in the community. Her life revolved around her teaching work, her family, and her deep Catholic faith. Because of this, her presence at church on the night before Easter was completely normal. Irene's purpose in going to Sacred Heart was to attend the sacrament of confession. This was a familiar religious practice for Catholics, especially during Holy Week. The priest responsible for hearing confessions that evening was John Bernard Feet, a young priest around 27 years old serving at the church. Several witnesses confirmed having seen Irene at the Sacred Heart grounds on the night of April 16. That was also the last time she was seen alive. After that point, all traces of Irene's movements became unclear. As the night passed and Irene still had not returned home, concern began to grow within her family. Those close to her understood that her disappearance without informing anyone was highly unusual. Irene had a stable routine and always kept in contact with the people around her. During the initial search, her car was discovered near the church area. This suggested that Irene likely never drove away from the location she had visited that night. In addition, some of her personal belongings were also found in the surrounding area, raising further questions about what had happened after she was last seen. For the Garza family, those first hours were filled with deep anxiety. For the McAllen community, the unusual absence of a well-known young woman quickly became a topic of concern. And as time continued to pass without any reasonable explanation, people began to realize that this might no longer be a simple missing persons case. After the final encounter at Sacred Heart Catholic Church, on the evening of the 16th of April 1960, Irene Garza disappeared from the sight of her family, friends, and the entire McAllen community. For many years, what truly happened after she entered the church remained a mystery. Investigators could only piece together fragments of information from the crime scene, witness statements, and evidence collected over decades of investigation. According to later findings released in the investigation, Irene became the victim of an assault that occurred after she arrived at the church to confess. Evidence suggested that she did not voluntarily leave the area as originally planned. The traces discovered during the investigation indicated that the incident occurred within a relatively short period after she was last seen. As authorities began reviewing the timeline of that evening, one detail quickly drew attention. The last known person to have contact with Irene before her disappearance was John Bernard Feet, the young priest serving at Sacred Heart Church. This was significant information, as very few individuals could confirm what had happened after Irene entered the confessional area. However, the initial investigation faced many obstacles. In 1960, forensic science methods were still limited. Modern techniques such as DNA analysis, electronic databases, and advanced tracking technologies did not yet exist. Investigators largely relied on witness statements, paper records, and physical evidence collected at the scene. In this context, reconstructing the full sequence of events on the night of April 16 became an extremely difficult task. Many key details could not be verified immediately. Some information appeared in the form of indirect testimony, while physical evidence over time became increasingly difficult to confirm. These gaps caused the case to enter a prolonged phase filled with unanswered questions. As investigators continued searching for answers, the focus of the file increasingly centered on what had occurred inside and around Sacred Heart Church on the night before Easter that year. As the night of April 16 gradually passed and Irene Garza still had not returned home, concern within her family began to grow. For those close to her, it was highly unusual for Irene to lose contact for such an extended period. She had a stable daily routine, kept in regular communication with her family, and rarely changed her plans without prior notice. In the hours that followed, family and friends began searching for information about Irene's final movements. They contacted people who may have seen her earlier that day and checked the places she usually visited. All attention quickly turned to Sacred Heart Catholic Church, where Irene was last seen on Holy Saturday evening. During the search, Irene's car was discovered still parked near the church area. This immediately raised serious concerns. If Irene had left as planned, her vehicle should no longer have been there. This discovery shifted her family's concern into genuine alarm. McAllen police were soon notified and began taking on the case. At first, investigators attempted to determine whether this might be a voluntary disappearance. However, evidence gathered shortly afterward indicated that the situation was far more serious than initially believed. Not long after, the search led to a tragic discovery. Irene's body was found in an area near McAllen. The news quickly spread throughout the city. For the local community, this was not only the loss of a young woman, but also a shock to a town known for its peaceful life and close-knit relationships. The incident immediately drew widespread attention. A beloved teacher had become the victim of a serious crime. While the family faced an irreparable loss, investigators began entering a more difficult phase, determining what had happened to Irene Garza in the final hours of her life. When Irene Garza's body was discovered, authorities in McAllen quickly initiated crime scene procedures according to the standards of that time. The surrounding area was carefully examined in search of any trace that could help reconstruct the final hours of the victim's life. Investigators recorded the location where the body was found, surveyed the surrounding area, and collected any physical evidence considered relevant to the case. In parallel with the processing of the scene, individuals who had been in contact with Irene in the days before her disappearance were also interviewed. Police attempted to reconstruct her movements, identify the places she had visited, and determine the people she had interacted with during the final period before she went missing. Each statement was compared in an effort to identify consistencies or discrepancies that might lead to important clues. Forensic examination determined that Irene died as a result of a serious assault. The official report provided investigators with basic details regarding the condition of the victim at the time she was found, and helped eliminate some of the initial theories regarding the cause of death. However, many key questions remained unanswered. During the evidence collection process, investigators documented various types of physical evidence, including Irene's personal belongings, traces found at the location where her body was discovered, and information provided by witnesses. Each detail was recorded in the case file in the hope that it might help identify the person responsible. However, the investigation quickly encountered major limitations in forensic science at the time. In 1960, law enforcement did not have access to tools that modern investigators consider fundamental. DNA databases did not exist. Genetic analysis technology was not yet practically available. Comparison of biological samples using advanced methods was entirely impossible. As a result, much of the investigation relied on witness testimony, direct observation, and traditional forensic techniques. When certain critical traces could not be further analyzed with modern technology, the Irene Garza case gradually became one of the most complex investigations the local authorities had ever faced. The remaining gaps in evidence made the path to the truth far longer than investigators had initially expected. In the early days after the case occurred, investigators in McAllen began reviewing all individuals who had any connection to Irene Garza prior to her disappearance. Their goal was to determine who had seen the victim during the final period and whether anyone possessed information that could help clarify the case. A series of interviews were conducted, ranging from family members, friends, and colleagues to individuals who were present in the Sacred Heart Church area on the night of the 16th of April 1960. Among the many names that appeared in the file, John Bernard Fate quickly became a person of particular interest to investigators. At the time, Fate was a young priest serving at Sacred Heart Church. According to police findings, he was the last known person to have had contact with Irene before she disappeared. This detail meant that all of his actions and explanations were carefully examined. During the verification process, investigators also recorded additional information related to Fate. Statements from individuals who had previously interacted with him led police to believe that this line of inquiry required further attention. However, suspecting someone and proving criminal conduct are two entirely different matters. In 1960, investigative systems relied heavily on witness testimony and traditional physical evidence. Despite several questions surrounding Fate, authorities still lacked decisive evidence that could move the case forward legally. Suspicion existed within the file, but it was not sufficient to result in formal criminal charges. Meanwhile, public pressure continued to grow. The people of McAllen wanted to know what had happened to Irene and who was responsible for her death. However, time passed without a significant breakthrough in the investigation. Eventually, John Bernard Fate left McAllen. Combined with the lack of direct evidence, the Irene Garza case gradually stalled. Over the years, it remained an unanswered question for both the victim's family and the local community. At this point, the truth seemed to fade into silence. After the initial investigative efforts failed to produce clear results, the Irene Garza case gradually entered the longest phase in its history. As time passed, active investigations decreased, new leads became scarce, and the chances of finding answers seemed increasingly distant. For Irene's family, the waiting did not last for months or years, it lasted for decades. Each passing year brought the same unanswered question. What truly happened to Irene on the night before Easter in 1960, and who was responsible for her death? Meanwhile, the case file remained preserved within the Texas justice system. Although no final conclusion had been reached, investigative reports, witness statements, and collected evidence still existed as part of an unresolved case. Occasionally, new investigators or prosecutors would revisit the file, in hopes of finding a detail that had been overlooked. In another development, John Bernard Feet continued his life outside McAllen. After leaving the area where the investigation had taken place, he lived in various locations over the years. For many local residents, this created an increasing sense of injustice, as suspicions remained but were never tested in a court of law. As time went on, many key witnesses grew older. Some early investigators retired. Many individuals directly or indirectly connected to the case eventually passed away before the truth was uncovered. Each passing year meant fading memories and diminishing access to original sources of information. Nevertheless, the Irene Garza case never completely disappeared from public attention. The victim's family continued to speak out. Some journalists, investigators, and prosecutors persisted in pursuing the case. This persistence kept the pursuit of justice alive, even after decades of silence. And then, when many believed the truth might remain buried forever, a witness emerged with information that would change the entire direction of the investigation. After more than 4 decades of stagnation, the Irene Garza case suddenly showed signs of movement. In 2002, a man named Dale Tupney, a former cleric who had spent time in a religious environment connected to John Bernard Feet, decided to contact law enforcement. The information he provided quickly drew the attention of investigators. According to Tupney's account, in the early 1960s, he had once heard Feet refer to a serious incident involving the death of a young woman. This information did not come from community rumors, but from someone who had direct contact with Feet within a religious setting. This made the statement something that investigators treated with caution but seriousness. For investigators, this was a particularly significant development. For decades, the Irene Garza file had contained numerous suspicions surrounding John Feet, but no evidence had ever been strong enough to produce a breakthrough. The new statement did not by itself prove any criminal conduct, but it opened a line of inquiry that had not previously been fully explored. After receiving the information, authorities began reviewing all archived case files from the 1960s. Thousands of pages of documents were re-examined. Old interview records, investigative reports, forensic notes, and materials previously considered secondary were reassessed from a new perspective. This process allowed investigators to realize that many details had existed in the file from the very beginning but had never been properly connected. Some earlier statements, once seen as unrelated, began to show notable similarities. Gaps in the case timeline were also re-examined using modern investigative approaches. Although the truth had not yet been confirmed at that time, a door that had remained nearly closed for many years had begun to open. The investigation was revived after more than 4 decades of silence, and for the first time in many years, authorities believed they might be closer to the answer that Irene Garza's family had been waiting for since 1960. In 2016, one of the most significant developments in the Irene Garza case finally occurred. More than half a century after she disappeared in McAllen, authorities arrested John Bernard Feet in the state of Arizona. At that time, Feet was 84 years old. The former young priest from Sacred Heart Church in 1960 had become an elderly man living far away from where the crime had taken place decades earlier. The arrest marked a historic turning point in the Irene Garza case file. For decades, the victim's family and those following the case had repeatedly witnessed investigative efforts stalled by a lack of evidence or legal barriers. Now, for the first time, the suspect long suspected since the earliest days of the investigation was brought before the justice system to face formal charges. After completing the necessary legal procedures, the case went to trial in Texas in 2017. The trial quickly attracted significant public and media attention, not only because of the seriousness of the crime, but also because of the extraordinary length of time between the original incident and the court proceedings. During the trial, prosecutors presented the jury with the full sequence of events compiled over decades of investigation. Historical documents from the 1,960 case file were re-examined in court. New testimony gathered during the reopened investigation was also presented. In addition, details concerning the final moments when Irene Garza was last seen alive at Sacred Heart Church were introduced. The prosecution argued that when all the evidence was considered together, the overall picture of the case had become much clearer than what investigators had been able to see in the early 1960s. Meanwhile, the defense challenged the reliability of evidence that emerged decades later and highlighted the inherent difficulties of a case that had gone unresolved for so long. After reviewing all documents, testimony, and arguments from both sides, the jury reached its final verdict. John Bernard Feet was found guilty in the death of Irene Garza and was sentenced to life imprisonment. For Irene's family, this was the moment they had waited for more than 56 years. Although justice came very late, the 2017 trial finally brought an official answer to a case that had haunted the McAllen community for generations. Nearly 6 decades. That was the length of time Irene Garza's family had to wait for an official verdict from the justice system. For many people, 57 years represents an entire lifetime. During that time, Irene's parents, siblings, friends, and loved ones lived with unanswered questions. They knew their loved one was gone, but they did not know whether justice would ever be served. When the final verdict was delivered, it could not bring Irene back. It also could not restore the years her family had lived through in waiting, disappointment, and uncertainty. Many people connected to the case were no longer alive to witness the moment the truth was formally acknowledged. Even so, the ruling carried special significance. After decades, a case that had remained dormant in archives finally received an official legal resolution. The Irene Garza case demonstrates how time can make an investigation increasingly difficult. Witnesses age, memories fade, evidence is lost or deteriorates. The limitations of forensic science in earlier decades also meant that many opportunities to solve the case were missed. At times, the case seemed destined to remain an unsolved mystery forever. However, the story also shows a different truth. A cold case does not necessarily mean a forgotten case. When new information emerges, and investigators re-examine what was once overlooked, the truth can still be found even after many decades. After 57 years, Irene Garza is no longer just a name in old investigative files. She was a young woman who had a family, a teaching career she loved, a faith she held deeply, and plans for her future. Her life was cut short far too early, but in the end, history remembered her by her name. If you are interested in real cases, cold cases solved after many years, and stories where justice takes decades to return, don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for following this story to the end.